The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Gene Sperling on the economic dignity that all workers deserve. Manuel Pastor on why we need a solidarity economy now more than ever. And Bill Press with former North Dakota Senator Byron Dorgan on why Democrats need to play hardball on Justice Ginsburg's replacement. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight, and follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Gene Sperling's newest book offers a powerful vision of America's economic future. He says we must not lose sight of what economic policy is all about, which is allowing people to lead dignified lives. And we say hello to Gene Sperling, former director of the National Economic Council under both Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. He's also the author, most recently, of Economic Dignity. Gene Sperling, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Your book argues for a new way to talk about whether the economy is doing well by workers. You call it economic dignity. What does that phrase mean to you?
You know, my goal was to actually have a step back. This was before, I wrote this before COVID, to step back and ask, what should our ultimate end goal of economic policy be? So that was my initial inquiry. And from there, I started realizing that when you got past all the politics, all the metrics, all the things we use to judge the economy, that fundamentally, it is a sense of universal economic dignity should be the ultimate North Star for economic policy. And I define that as meaning three pillars that are essential. You can't have two of the three, all three. One, are you able to, through your work and contribution, not only care for your family, but be there for your family, not only put food at the table, but be at the table and at the bedside and the bedtime stories for those things that are most precious and equal in all of our lives. And so that was the first pillar. The second was, do we have the capacity to pursue our potential and sense of purpose and meaning? And do we have first and second chances to reach that? And third is that can we contribute with respect as opposed to domination and humiliation? Because what I wanted to make clear was that you can't have just the first two, because people may be so desperate to put food on the table, to care for their family, to succeed in their jobs, that without protection, that can force them to be subject to the type of humiliation and domination, which is the antithesis of dignity. So that is my three-pillar definition of economic dignity and why that should be our ultimate North Star for economic policy.
And I want to break each of those down individually. And before we do that, you mentioned kind of our usual metrics for evaluating the economy, unemployment rates, GDP. What do we miss by relying on these measures?
Well, I think people understand that relying on GDP or the stock market as a metric for well-being is not very good measure for whether we're providing economic dignity for all of our people. But I think we're seeing that even something like the unemployment rate that we think is perhaps a better proxy for overall well-being really doesn't tell the story. It makes lots of economic pain invisible. It makes lots of people going through economic pain invisible. So, for example, the unemployment rate was very low before COVID, but now as we are looking more closely, shining a spotlight on the actual economic condition of essential workers, we say to ourselves, well, even if unemployment was low, is it right that a farm worker who's providing our food, that only 50% of them get health care, or that the woman on the front lines risking their lives to care for our family couldn't take a day, or half of them couldn't take a day of paid sick leave to care for their own families. We realize when we see people like the poultry and meat workers who are forced back to work in unsafe conditions, they have little ability to stand up for themselves. We recognize that even relying on unemployment or other measures, while they're more important, don't tell the full story. And so I think that for us to truly keep our eye on the ball, we have to look more at these three pillars. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't look for statistics to see if you're meeting them, but you don't let yourself believe that one of those metrics is our ultimate North Star in and of themselves. A lower unemployment rate may be a good sign, but if people don't have housing, if they don't have economic security, if they don't have health care, if they don't have paid sick leave, it may not tell a very complete story as to whether they are living with economic dignity or not.
Almost like it's the cover of the book, but you got to read what's inside and kind of get down to the nitty gritty. Let's talk about the three pillars that you mentioned, starting with the economic dignity, the capacity to care for family without economic deprivation. What are the workplace conditions that interfere with this value, and what are the policies that can promote it?
Right. And so I think that progressives often rightly give a list of things like, are you working, unemployment rate, do you have housing? These things are all critically important. But if he is working 95 hours a week, if they're not actually there to be able to care for their child, or just to experience the season by season joys of life that should be universally available to us, we should not say we've succeeded. It's one thing if somebody wants to work I used to be like that. If somebody wants to work 90 hours a week because they're so thrilled with their job, or they didn't have kids at home, hey, that's their right. But when people have to go through such hardship that they cannot experience the basic joys that should be equally available to all of us. We all know that being there perhaps for the birth of a child, or being at the bedside for a parent in their last moment can be, among the most special and critical moments of life. And yet those things are denied economically to millions of people all the time. Right now, many people have gone through what I have, losing a parent where you couldn't be there for them due to COVID. Well, the reality is that millions of people aren't there for their loved ones in their last moments because they can't take a day off, or they can't, they don't have paid. They may be allowed to take time off for the birth of the child, but they can't actually experience those moments. So to me, when you ask, about, do you have a job? Do you have a wage? Can you put food on the table? If we're treating each of us as human beings and recognizing the intrinsic universal economic dignity, we should say, what is that spiritual or God-given equality that all of us have in life, that all of us should be able to enjoy regardless of our state? And what can we do to make sure economic deprivation does not deny any of us those basic joys and experience of being a person?
The second pillar, the right to the pursuit of potential and purpose. Where do you see the nation failing on this account?
We fail terribly on this. And I think this was important. I wanted to put in because I do, again, feel sometimes people say, well, our goal is just to get these 3 or 4 goods and services. Well, that's not who we are. We're not just people who provide food on the table, or even necessarily just want to experience the joys of care. Most of us want to have a sense that there's a purpose, that we're contributing, that we have at least an opportunity to reach our potential as we define it. For that to happen, you have to give people actually real first chances, and we all need second chances as well. And what's interesting is that we are a nation that celebrates the value that the accident of your birth should not determine the outcome of your life. And yet we know that it is exactly the accident of your birth, if you're poor, if you're born into racism or poverty, that can deny you any realistic chance to have the same opportunity to succeed. But secondly, we're also a nation that treasures second chances. We've never lived up to that, of course, when it's come to African Americans and many other people, but that vision was intrinsic to the idealized values of our country. We were the first nation to get rid of debt prisons. We were the first nation to say you can have a fresh start after bankruptcy. We talk about the second chances of athletes or tech stars who failed and came back. And yet, we have a system where if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, lose your job through a plant closing, or you're in a place hard hit by recession, or if you're caught up in the criminal justice system in any way, it is almost like we have designed our policy to deny you that second chance. And that second chance is about your capacity to feel that you are contributing and pursuing your contribution to your country, to your family, and to yourself. And when we deny that, we not only deny economic dignity, we're also denying economic growth for those who focus on that, because we are taking people who could be adding to our country and putting barriers in front of them that they cannot get over.
We're speaking with Gene Sperling, former director of the National Economic Council under both Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, also the author most recently of Economic Dignity. Potential and purpose to some might seem outside the province of government. Why and how should the government engage to make sure potential and purpose is available to all?
Well, right. I mean, look, I say in the beginning of the book that economic dignity, or it's not that every one of us gets to reach our potential. It's really, do we have a basic first chances and second chances to do so? And I think that when you look at first chances, obviously, it just goes against everything our country believes in, that if you are born just by the accident of your birth, we know, a child born white in a relatively privileged upper middle class family by the accident of their birth is very, very likely to graduate from a four-year college. A child born into a poor area, perhaps African American, because of systemic racism, because of disadvantage, that child born with the same abilities, the same potential, has a tiny chance of, or a very small chance of graduating from a four-year college. There are policies we can do, but there's no silver bullet. It has to be a dramatic, significant effort to both increase economic opportunity, increase not just educational opportunity in the schools and from birth, but also all the networking and advantages so many middle-class kids have by having great after-school programs, abilities to do internship, to prepare for SATs. There are so many. When you talk about inequality, it's not just a number. It is an entire process that disadvantages some people at the expense of others. The second thing, beyond giving those first chances, is, one of the things I talk about in the book is that while we're the first country to get rid of debt prisons, we are creating new debt prisons. We are saying, if you go through the criminal justice system at all, even if you're innocent or tangentially related, we put so many fines and fees and restrictions and stigma on you that people really second chance. And we don't do nearly enough for people who suffer serious dislocations. So to me, I said, this is something where the policies may be very different. Some may be about what you're doing for factory workers who've lost jobs in their 50s. Some of it may be for what you're doing to do quality 0 to 5 education for children born into a poor situation. But they all fit under a basic value that unites us, which is that all of us should at least be able to pursue that potential, pursue that sense of purpose and meaning as we define it, and not have government policy set barriers that prevent that.
And then the third pillar, as you've explained, economic participation without domination and humiliation. And I got to say, it's hard to believe that anyone would be an advocate for domination and humiliation in the workplace. So what are we missing? And what more do we need to do, again, to eliminate something like domination and humiliation from the workplace?
Well, you may say that people are not advocates for it, but it's not good enough just to to say that you're not an advocate for domination or for humiliation. You have to be an advocate for workers having a degree of protection that is not subject to market and economic power. The entire notion of unionization and the collective bargaining movement was understanding that despite the idealized view that the employer and the employee can equally bargain, that in fact an employee taking on a large company alone or the job market alone is like the Tiananmen Square man in front of the tank. What gives people power is two things. One, that there's actual legal protection in the law. You cannot sexually harass by law. You cannot pay somebody less because of their race or any many other characteristics that are discriminatory. So that's the legal side. But then there's the economic power side. Do you have the capacity to bond together, whether it's through traditional collective bargaining or some of the strategies we've seen from the SEIU or from the National Domestic Workers Association, where they are mobilizing at state capitals to get $15 minimum wages or to get boards put in place to ensure domestic workers have protection. All of those things are the kind of protections that matter. And let me tell you, when you talk about domination and humiliation, we're not talking about the last turn of the century. I mentioned poultry workers. Poultry workers are 7 times more likely to have carpal tunnel syndrome, twice as likely to have serious injury. There's been reports of many having to wear diapers because the line speed of birds is so fast. There are stories of dehumanizing behavior happening throughout our economy. And look, we've seen it. We've seen workers penalized for just wanting PPE to protect themselves when they're delivering food to us or helping to manage or save our own lives. So the fact is, if you're not for the power of workers through both law and the ability to collectively bargain, you are opening the door to people with less, who can be desperate to put food on the table, to be subject to all forms of economic domination. And it may not be quite as bad today as it was in southern West Virginia with the coal miners in the early part of the 20th century. But let me tell you, there is no shortage of examples. Female janitors working overnight alone, often isolated, et cetera, where they are subject to horrific treatment because they do not have the protection or the collective worker power to take it on.
It's pretty awful when you think about where we are as a country and but where we should be. As big and strong as we are and as great as we are, and here we have these horrible stories that you referenced there. Before we let you go, can you imagine a national politics in the White House, in Congress, and state and local politics that can support the ideas needed to make these 3 pillars, something that everybody has the ability or has the ability to take advantage of?
Yes, I do believe so. Sometimes people have said to me that economic dignity is an important theme for unifying Democrats, that it's a theme that a Bill Clinton or an AOC or Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders feel comfortable with, and it unifies us on a kind of more humanistic goal that we all support, even if people have different strategies. But I also think it speaks to not just the progressive movement. I think it speaks to an unrealized American ideal. I often do a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and I ask people who's the quote's from, and they think it's Bernie Sanders, but it's Teddy Roosevelt from 1912. And what I'm saying is that basic notion that if you're trying to contribute, if you're trying to pull your share of the load, if you're working hard, you're doing your part, that there is a degree of protection and dignity you should have in your ability to work with dignity, care for your family with dignity, and retire with dignity. And so I think the idea of that really transcends a little bit of the normal political divide that we have. That doesn't sound like a list of programs from the right or left. It sounds like something that can unify us. All of us know what it's like to work hard, to do our part, to struggle with work, to lose jobs. But the notion that all of us want to be treated with a certain degree of respect, to be able to be there for life's most precious moments, to be able to, as Joe Biden say, look your kid in the eye and say things are going to be okay. Those are more universal beliefs that I think can unify us. And look, I've been negative, but there's a lot of positive things out there. We are seeing an expansion in unemployment insurance for people who were never covered before. We are seeing more people getting paid sick leave. It's not enough, but there's progress. We have seen groups like domestic workers that Ai-jen Poo and Mary Kay Henry at the SEIU, have organized and have gone to the streets and gotten a $15 minimum wage when there wasn't a chance of getting it in Washington. We've seen the earned income tax credit expand so much that a parent making $17,000 can now get maybe $7,000 or $8,000 more in refundable tax credit. So as I always say, if you're a progressive, you should be painfully unhappy with the distance we still have to go. But we should also recognize good things do happen when good people are fighting together. And right now we can see both how big the gap is, but we can also see the progress of people unifying around a value like economic dignity.
And the name of the book is Economic Dignity. The author, Gene Sperling, former director of the National Economic Council under both Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Gene, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Anytime, and I so appreciate you giving me a chance to talk about these very important issues. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, Manuel Pastor on reshaping the post-COVID world by focusing on equity. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Amazingly, America has become a nation of socialists, asking in dismay, where's the government? These are not born-again Bernie Sanders activists, but everyday people of all political stripes, including previously apolitical multitudes who are now clamoring for big government intervention in their lives. Nothing like a spreading coronavirus pandemic to bring home the need that all of us have, both as individuals and as a society, for an adequately funded, fully functioning, competent government capable of serving all. Instead, in our moment of critical national need, Trump's government has been a rickety medicine show run by a small-minded flim-flammer peddling laissez-fairyland snake oil. We have it totally under control, Trump pompously declared after the first U.S. case was confirmed in January. For weeks, as the pandemic spread out of control, he did nothing. An increasingly anxious public found that they couldn't even get reliable test kits from Trump's hollowed-out government health agencies. Still, he shrugged off all concern and responsibility. By April, in theory, he said, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. Not exactly a can-do Rooseveltian response to a national crisis. That complete absence of White House leadership is why a deadly pathogen is now raging practically everywhere across our land. Unknown millions of us are being infected. A closed indefinitely sign has literally been hung on the American economy, and even our people's social and civic interactions, the essence of community life, have been halted. This is Jim Hightower saying, right-wing politico Grover Norquist once said he wanted a government so small I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. Trump has shown us what such a small-minded government looks like and what it costs us.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you. The Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The disparate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color has been deep and devastating. That's why Manuel Pastor calls for an economy focused on solidarity to recover from the pandemic and build a more just and sustainable economic future. And we say hello to Dr. Manuel Pastor, a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He's also serving on Governor Newsom's task force for COVID-19 recovery. His most recent book, State of Resistance: What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Mean for America's Future. Dr. Manuel Pastor, thank you for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Glad to be with you this morning.
And actually, I should say welcome back to America's Democrats Podcast. You've been working on a very important issue, which is how we build back from this pandemic in a way that is equitable. So let's begin with where we are now. As we know too well, people of color are experiencing the health impacts and the economic impacts of this pandemic in vastly disproportionate measures. How are you seeing this play out in California?
Well, it's been quite dramatic in California. In many ways, COVID is the disease that revealed our fundamental illnesses as a society. The precarity of employment and the lack of wealth, particularly in the part of African American and Latino households, the precarious nature as well of legal status. Here in Los Angeles County, 18% of our population is either undocumented or living with a family member who is undocumented, and that group got largely frozen out of federal relief in any kind of a way. And if you look at the data, what's gone on is that a disease that at its beginning in California, about 30% of Latinos, about 30% of the cases were Latino. Now it's about 60% of the cases are Latino, because what's happened is that a community that tends to be over-indexed in essential work, that also tends to be living in overcrowded conditions, and also is susceptible because of the lack of documentation to have to go to work no matter what the circumstances are, is a population that's going to acquire these cases. And if you look at the mortality rates in California, the mortality rates for African Americans are about twice what they are for white Californians, for Latinos a little bit more. So we've got a situation in which we should have known this was going to happen because of the underlying pre-existing conditions of employment, lack of housing, and exposure to air. And it has played out that way.
Now, in thinking about how we move out of this in a more equitable way, you advocate for an approach that you call solidarity economics. In broad strokes, what does that mean?
Well, I think it means three kind of fundamental things. One is understanding that the way we've tended to think about the economy in the past is all wrong. People tend to think about the economy either from the right or the left as people are self-interested. That's primarily how they act. And the right tends to think that the market is going to steer that to a blissful outcome. The left tends to think that people are self-interested and we need the state to regulate. That does make some degree of sense. But what's interesting is that people also act out of impulses of solidarity and mutuality. You see this in a pandemic in which the reason we're wearing our masks is in order to protect ourselves, but in order to protect others who are around us. And we know that if we are going to get through this public health emergency, we need to make sure that we are protecting the people who are the most vulnerable, and that we need to reconceptualize what we think is essential work. As you know, important work is usually thought of as higher paid work, like being a professor or managing a hedge fund. But that's not as essential as being an agricultural worker, a truck driver, a grocery store clerk, a nurse's assistant, or a nurse or a doctor. So we need to kind of rethink what is essential work, and the fact that mutuality will actually get us to our best economic circumstances. Second, we need to understand that we need to prioritize those who've been on the short end of our distributional structure. Because when we make sure that we're protecting the communities that are the most vulnerable, we're protecting everyone. And that's going to be key. And third, we need to understand that our solidarity with one another is going to be key to changing the patterns of economic inequality, which has put us in the circumstances that we've got now. So what solidarity economics tries to do is to lift up our impulses toward mutuality, understand that those are going to be what's going to get us out of this or any other economic crisis, and understand that we need to garner the political power by standing with each other to transform the economic conditions that have left so many vulnerable.
In terms of policy change, you're calling for a three-part approach: lift the bottom, grow the middle, tame the top. Applying that to healthcare reform, what type of changes do we need to see?
I mean, that's a really good guiding set of principles, because in terms of lifting the bottom on the economic side, that means something like raising the minimum wage, thinking of housing as a right, making sure everybody's got a clean environment. On the healthcare side, that means making sure everyone has access to health insurance and health care. I mean, imagine what the world would look like right now if we had Medicare for all. The people who've been the most vulnerable would be accessing health care, and that would wind up protecting all of us. The growing the middle means understanding what we need to do in terms of job development. So we need to be growing the care industry, and in particular the healthcare industry, and that's a route to better jobs for lots of folks of color. I mean, if you think about, for example, childcare and elder care, both industries that have been enormously disrupted by COVID, but are industries in which there's an over-concentration of folks of color. If we actually try to improve the working conditions and the training there, we would wind up lifting the economy for so many people. And taming the top generally means higher taxes on the wealthy, things like a wealth tax, progressive income taxes, etc. But it also means understanding that we've got a distorted economy, which instead of trying to figure out how to solve basic healthcare issues of access and homelessness, is spending all sorts of money on figuring out how to deliver high-end healthcare to the wealthy. So taming the top means getting rid of the distortionary effects that high-income people have in terms of steering where our research is on healthcare, steering who our healthcare system serves, and steering who our economy rewards. Again, we've got an economy that gives its biggest rewards to people who are managing the wealth of the wealthy instead of people who are managing the health and well-being of all of us. And the only way we're going to get that out of our system is by restricting the political power of the wealthy over what we do around things like Medicare for all, which we know would be good for all of us, but is resisted because it will steer dollars away from pharmaceutical industries and healthcare providers that are making way too much money. And it will only happen to change if we reduce the power of the wealthy in our political decision making.
We're speaking with Dr. Manuel Pastor, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. His most recent book, State of Resistance, What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Mean for America's Future. Let's talk about education. With remote learning, we're facing huge disparities in terms of access to the tools that make it possible. What can we do now during this pandemic to bring more equity into our nation's education system and then even beyond the pandemic, moving forward?
Well, it's an absolutely crucial issue. In the work that we've done in Los Angeles, and we're releasing a report in a few weeks called No Going Back, Together for an Equitable and Inclusive Los Angeles, we really try to take a look at the way in which this pandemic, again, has revealed our underlying inequalities. When schools in Los Angeles County shut down in response to COVID and kids went home for remote learning, 13% of white kids were on the wrong side of the digital divide, meaning they did not have at their home the combination of a laptop or a computer and high-speed internet access. Again, that figure for white kids, 13%. That figure for black kids, 37%. That figure for Latino kids, 39%. So basically for these communities, remote learning was really a fantasy. As much as the schools tried to provide hotspots and Chromebooks, that's just not the same thing as already having high-speed internet cable access into your home and having a device that allows you to access it on a big screen. So one of the things that's going to be really crucial in the coming years is addressing this digital inequality. And when most people think about addressing it, they think about getting the cable lines, for example, internet access out to poorer communities of color. But that's not enough. In places like South LA and East Los Angeles, the lines were already out there. It's that people can't afford to pay the access fees to get on the internet. They don't have the devices that are sufficient to actually make full use of the internet, and they don't necessarily have the training. So you've got a lot of folks who, Comcast comes to them, but there's no lifeline fee so they can get on for free. They've got nothing more than a phone. And there's stories of Latina workers going to work, leaving their phones at home so their kids can try to access the internet to take classes. And they may have grandparents there who don't know how to use it. So this is a really crucial issue, the internet. But when you start taking a look at the inequalities in spending on education, and you start to think about the principles that we need to make sure that all children have equitable access to the tools they need in terms of learning, we've got a long way to go. And we also need to realize, and this is something I think is a big mistake, that we tend to think that if we address the educational side of the equation, that's going to be enough. One of the things that we reveal in our report is that even if you control for education and say, let's look at folks with a high school degree, let's look at folks with a college degree like a BA, let's look at folks in the middle who have, for example, a degree from a community college. At each and every level, there's racial inequality in terms of the wages for full-time year-round workers because there's ongoing discrimination in labor markets. So yes, we need to close the digital divide. Yes, we need to close the achievement gap in terms of people graduating, but we also need to realize that there's problems with employer discrimination in not valuing the skills and work and work ethic and degrees that may be brought to them by Black and Latino workers in particular.
And staying on jobs and economy there, what needs to go into any future stimulus legislation that would make it equitable?
I think there's a couple of things that are important to realize. And one of them, just by way of analogy, I was in a conversation with the governor's staff just the other day about testing parity, meaning how do we make sure that communities of color, low-income communities, are getting as much access to COVID testing as other communities. And I agree that's the wrong metric. We need testing equity, not testing parity. We know that Black communities have a higher rate of mortality if they get this disease. They need more tests. We know that Latino communities are over-indexed along with Black communities in exposure at work, and they're far more over-indexed in terms of living in overcrowded conditions. Testing equity means getting them more tests. So a couple of things I think that need to be in a stimulus package in the future, and one of them is making sure that we're paying attention to workers that have had the least access in the past and making sure that they get the most access in the future. And one super key thing to realize is that the first CARES Act froze out undocumented workers, even if they were already paying taxes. So if you're undocumented and you are paying not with a social security number, but what's called an individual taxpayer identification number, and ITIN, you cannot get that federal relief check. And worse than that, if you're in a family where two people filed jointly, one of them with a social security number, one of them with an ITIN, that entire family unit and their children can't get the federal relief. And they already can't access the unemployment insurance and the pandemic unemployment insurance. And that makes a huge difference in places in California. And you know, the usual image that people have of undocumented folks is someone who arrived recently, is lightly attached to the labor market, lightly attached to the community. In California, more than 2/3 of undocumented immigrants have been in the United States for a decade or longer. They're deeply embedded in communities, they're deeply embedded in their workplaces, and they have families, and these ripple effects go out with lack of support across their U.S.-born citizen children, family members, their lawful permanent resident spouses, aunts and uncles, etc. So that's a major fix that needs to be there. And I think the other kind of just guiding principle is understanding that these workers, not just undocumented workers, but all workers, their inability to get income right now is due to the mismanagement of this crisis by the Trump administration. And the idea of penalizing people for not, there's this discussion that we need to lower the benefits so we can incentivize people to go to work. My God, we do want people engaged in essential work to go to work, but we want people who don't need to go to work to not go to work so we can actually stop the spread of this disease. In future years, people are going to look at the Trump administration's combination of cruelty and stupidity, and they are going to say they were trying to fool us, but why did we let ourselves get fooled by the kind of story that the Trump administration is telling and the kind of damage that they've wrought to communities by ignoring the COVID crisis and inflaming the hostility around race that we see them actively trying to play out as they desperately make a play to try to become relevant in this electoral season.
Manuel, before you go, this pandemic, of course, has opened our eyes to the depth of racial disparities in our nation. Do you feel it will also increase our political will to finally do something about it?
I'm an optimistic person by nature. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, son of an undocumented immigrant, have had my own journey through America as well as my parents. And there's always reason for optimism when you think about those stories. Second, And it's in that book, State of Resistance. I was an activist and an academic in Los Angeles during the 1992 civil unrest, when it looked like our world had been torn apart. We were in a tremendous amount of economic dislocation, and communities were at each other's throat. And then, 25 years later, California is a leader in raising the minimum wage, a leader on addressing climate change, a leader on shutting down our prison systems, a leader on giving immigrants full rights. So I've seen an arc of change that is possible once people come to the realization that we need to do something different. And I think this moment is unique in American history for three reasons. One, of course, is the murder of George Floyd and the kind of racial reckoning that has triggered for Americans across the nation. But it's important to realize that happened after COVID had already opened our eyes to the ways in which, when you have an unequal nation, you're going to have an unequal pandemic. And that also came on the heels of 3.5 years of the Trump administration brutalizing our norms and fanning the flames of racial hostility. So I feel like there's a really deep shift that's gone on. One would have thought that this Trump appeal to law and order and, it's hardly covert appeal to both racism and racial anxiety would play. But it looks like it's not playing as well as Nixon did back in the late 60s and early 1970s. And I have a reason I think I have optimism that it won't play. I think it's going to require, though, that folks who are on our side, after all, this is called America's Democrats, begin to recognize that we do need to come together, progressives and centrists, around this particular candidacy and of Biden and Harris. Recognize that this is an opportunity to turn the page on hate and begin to create the platform for going forward. We're going to have plenty of time to fight once we win about what policies we need to move in a more progressive direction, to direction that I would like. The moment now is to be able to talk to America about needing to end this national nightmare and create at least a platform for healing our economy, our spirit, our soul as a nation.
Dr. Manuel Pastor, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California, also serving on Governor Newsom's task force for COVID-19 recovery. And, of course, his most recent book, State of Resistance, What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Mean for America's Future. Joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Manuel, as always, we appreciate your time with us. Would love to have you back again soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with former North Dakota Senator Byron Dorgan on how to stop the GOP from stealing another Supreme Court judgeship.
Speaking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and now the battle to name her replacement. And we're joined now by former Democratic Senator Byron Dorgan of North Dakota. Senator Dorgan, good to talk to you. Thanks for giving us some time on the Bill Press Pod.
Well, nice to talk to you. Happy to do it.
So, Senator, you were in the Senate back in 1993 when President Clinton nominated Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Tell us about that confirmation battle and your vote.
Well, I voted for her. I was really happy to do that. I, met with her a couple times. She was a remarkable lawyer, Supreme Court justice. She was a justice in the lower courts as well. But she became, the most identifiable person on the U.S. Supreme Court. And much of that had to do with with the power of the ideas that she had about things. I was so happy to see. And she was, as you know, that vote was an overwhelming vote. I think there were only 3 negative votes cast against her.
Mm-hmm. Which is so unusual.
Like 96-3 the vote was, or something very unusual.
96-3. And the outpouring of public affection for her since her death was announced Friday night in front of the Supreme Court, a sea of flowers and signs and candles. Have you ever seen any outpouring of affection like that for any Supreme Court justice in your life?
Never. But, she became the notorious
RBG.
That was the word they used, RBG. And she was quite a remarkable woman. There have been documentaries about her now. But the power of her idea that drove a whole series of opportunities for women in this country is extraordinary. But even more than that, on the Supreme Court, I mean, she represented the American people in ways that were so strong. And when you would be able to read her dissenting opinions,
mm-hmm.
they were the best, or the majority opinions. They were the best opinions written on the Supreme Court.
Right. Such an incredible impact that she had on the court. So now the question is, Senator, who should appoint her replacement?
Well, whoever wins the presidency in November should, represent the opportunity to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court. But it ought to be that, not something else. It ought not be what Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump are hatching up. I mean, that is a circumstance that should not sit well with the American people, and they should not be allowed to get this done, in my judgment.
Before November 3rd, you're saying?
Or even after November 3rd, if the Democrats win the presidency, whoever wins this presidency, it's really interesting. Mitch McConnell, when they were able to keep Merrick Garland off the court, it was 8 or 9 or 10 months, right?
Yes.
He kept saying, no, we've got it. What we have to do is wait and give the American people the choice. Let the American people vote. Well, now he seems to be swallowing those words, and as do many of his colleagues in the Republican caucus, unfortunately. And I just think it's really important. This would make it a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court. It will put at risk the Affordable Care Act. That clearly will probably be gone. It'll put at risk Roe versus Wade. It'll put at risk racial justice issues. It's just an unbelievable circumstance to have a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court. They stole, as you know, the Supreme Court justice in the last year of Obama, and now they're preparing to do another one.
If you were still in the Senate today in the Democratic caucus, what would you be advising your fellow Democrats to do to stop that from happening?
Well, it is not easy because what they have done is they've taken the filibuster away, even on Supreme Court nominees. There is no circumstance, in my judgment, under any conditions, that you ought to put someone for life on the United States Supreme Court who doesn't have some sort of a consensus of approval by the American people. That is why there needs to have been 60 votes, which was always the case, 60 votes to get a Supreme Court justice on the court. And now Mitch McConnell, as you know, he threw that away. He changed the rules in the United Senate, and it is outrageous. The American people ought to change the rules for Mitch McConnell as well. I think they ought to say to him, stay home for a while, put us out in Kentucky, and send somebody else up there that won't do what he has done, which is very hypocritical.
So one step would be to, I guess, restore the filibuster, correct, for Supreme Court nominees.
Yes.
Right.
But they can't do that before this nominee. They're not going to have the votes to do that.
Correct.
I'm talking about the Democrats.
Right. I guess the first step will be to line up, if possible, enough Republicans to vote to delay until the next president can make the appointment. Correct. And what do you know about that? Have you had any conversations with your former colleagues? We know there are two senators, as we speak, two senators, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, have said they don't want to. They will not vote before the next president is decided. We need two more. Democrats need two more. Do you think that's possible?
Don't know. I think maybe unlikely, but we watched what happened in impeachment. We watched what's happened with the Republican caucus under Mitch McConnell. There are two Republicans, rather, I should say, who have said that they do not want to proceed to allow this nomination to go forward, at least not until the election is held. But even after that, this needs to be the province of the new president that is sworn in on January 20th. If it's Donald Trump, he's going to make the nomination. But if it's Joe Biden, that seat ought to be Joe Biden's seat to nominate.
Right. There's also talk of responding, if the Republicans go forward with this, with adding 2 people to the Supreme Court. Is that something you would support? Could support?
I don't know. I mean, that's something that's after next year, assuming that we win the presidency, assuming that the Democrats would control the Senate. There are a series of things that they might want to do, some of which might be considered. I personally really do not want to see the United States Senate decide to abolish the filibuster. There's discussion about that among Democratic senators, but I just think the Senate will become the House of Representatives. There will be nothing that represents the big decisions for this country that require some sort of national consensus. It'll be the majority plus one, right? And I think that would be a huge mistake, but there will be tremendous effort to try to do that.
Can Democrats slow things down? I don't know. I'm just asking, by not showing up?
Well, I do think the first thing they ought to do is decide if the Republicans proceed with this, they ought to inform Mitch McConnell that they're not going to agree with anything. It doesn't matter whether it's the least important piece of information. There will be no unanimous consent agreed to in the United States Senate. None, zero. Just the thing of approving the previous day's record. It's going to require a cloture vote, perhaps. It's going to require every senator come to the floor to vote. Every insignificant issue should be forced to be voted on. And that will slow the Senate down and almost, in my judgment, require the Senate can't work and get its job done. And the reason they have to threaten that is to say, you can't steal another judge here, another judgeship in the Supreme Court, which is what they're trying to do.
In other words, play hardball is what you're saying, I guess.
Absolutely. Look, they play hardball. And, this notion of they go low, we go high. Well, that's going high is fine. But I tell you what, sometimes you have to get down and wrestle and have a strong heart and a pretty good sized muscle to have your way. And I just think it's important to do sometimes.
This is the time to do it. How well do you think that Joe Biden has responded to this news of Justice Ginsburg passing?
I haven't seen all of his responses yet, but I think he's responded the way he should respond. This is an outrage. It really is an outrage. It's unfair to the American people, and it will have an impact on much of our lives for decades if this happens. And so, Joe Biden, I'm sure, as is everyone else from our perspective, angry about the hypocrisy here. The Republicans said Obama could not succeed in Merrick Garland's nomination for the Supreme Court. And it took, that was in 10 months because they said it was too soon. Let's wait until there's a presidential election. And after that, then we'll decide. Well, the fact is now it's 42 days.
Yeah.
You guys want to rush to the bank and deposit somebody on the Supreme Court for life. It's unbelievable.
And Biden has also tied this debate over the vote and the nomination to his core central message, which is protect the Affordable Care Act, which will be the first item on the new court's agenda.
Listen, these people have tried to kill the Affordable Care Act. I voted for that. It won by one vote in the United States Senate. I voted for it. I was proud to have voted for it. But they've tried to kill it now for 11 years. And the fact is, Donald Trump, although he wants to kill it, and so do all of his folks in the Republican caucus, they want to kill it. He doesn't have a plan. What you'll have is, millions and millions of Americans without health insurance as a result of this. If they're able to kill it, they put another conservative on the Supreme Court, they're going to kill the Affordable Care Act, and that's going to have a profound impact on the availability and the cost of health insurance across this country. When we did that, Bill, it's interesting. For the first time, we dealt with this issue of pre-existing conditions and said to insurance companies, you can't make your insurance either unaffordable or not available to people that have pre-existing health conditions. You must make it available. And so that's the first time we did that. Now, the fact is, he's in court right now, Donald Trump is, and his Justice Department, with the support of the attorneys generals, Republican attorneys generals, and the caucus and the Republican caucus in the Senate and the House. They're trying to kill it. And they have no plan to restore it. There's no plan behind it. So there's a lot at stake here, and it's life or death.
And I wanted to ask you finally, what impact do you think that this now battle over the confirmation will have, first on the presidential race, help Donald Trump or help Joe Biden, and secondly, on those important Senate races this year? Any impact at all, do you think?
Boy, I wish I knew. You know what? I'm so confused about this because at first I thought, well, maybe this is a case where that 30% that supports Donald Trump or whatever, the 30% who are pro-life, right, and oppose abortion, oppose the woman's right to choose, they're highly motivated. So maybe this gets all of them out in higher numbers. I don't know. On the other hand, it may well be the American people may look at this and say, something, we've had a belly full of this nonsense. We're sick and tired of the lying. We're sick and tired of the cheating. And we're sick and tired of somebody trying to steal a Supreme Court nominee or nomination, I should say. So I wish I knew, Bill. This could go either way.
Yeah, I know. It could energize Republicans. It could also energize Democrats. And, we saw $100 million in the first couple of days, Democratic donations to Act Blue, to candidates across the board.
You know what? I have always thought this election is about one thing and one thing only. People would go to the ballot box and they'd think, do I want 4 more years of this stuff? Is that what I really want? 4 more years of this president? And so that I just thought this is only going to be about Trump. And then all of a sudden, all these new issues in just 6 months, a pandemic, an economic deep recession, a Ruth Bader Ginsburg nomination. I mean, all of these things have come up. They're new, and none of us quite understand how does this impact the American people. But I hope people take a look at this and they see the embarrassing nonsense coming out of this White House, the impulsiveness, the danger coming out of the White House, and decide, you know what, we've had enough of it. We're sick and tired of it.
And do you think that drips down, if you will, into some of the Senate races? I don't imagine they call you for advice, but if a Cory Gardner, or a Joni Ernst or were to call you and Tom Tillis in North Carolina and say, hey, I'm in a tough race. This presents a problem for me. What should I do? What would
no, they don't call me Bill. But I would say if someone you're supporting, in this case President Trump, is doing something that is just stupid and unexplainable and seen as terribly unfair, maybe it's up to you to say that. Maybe it's up to you to say, I'm not going along with this nonsense any longer. But that's not going to happen. I do think that they probably will not cast a vote before Election Day, so they don't put those Republican close races in that position. But I think right after the election, I think these guys are on a path that's terrible for this country.
Bill Press with former North Dakota Senator Byron Dorgan. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Gene Sperling, Manuel Pastor, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.